David Vitter is a bold conservative reformer who is working to solve the most significant problems facing our state and our nation with Louisiana common sense. Senator Vitter works to support small businesses and entrepreneurs, and he believes we need a fairer, simpler tax code to encourage economic growth. He is fighting for real budget reform to stop the growth of our skyrocketing national debt, and he believes that the current regulatory climate coming from Washington will do little more than inhibit job creation. Senator Vitter was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1999. He was elected to his first term in the Senate in 2004 and overwhelmingly re-elected in 2010. He serves as the top Republican on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. David and his wife, Wendy, have 4 children and live in Shrevary.
Thank you very much, Sandy and Carol and Jeff, and thanks to all of you for the invitation to be here. Jill, thank you for the prayer, because you now have instilled in me a new goal in the U.S. Senate, which is to regularly see Harry Reid, Al Franken, and Barbara Boxer limping around the floor on a regular basis. Actually, Barbara Boxer and I work very closely on this committee that was mentioned, the Environment Committee, and actually have a very good working relationship, although we disagree on a lot of things. And Joe, I cannot wait to tell her on the Senate floor that I'm a member of Go Green and she isn't. So. It's great to be with all of you, and actually I thought I'd spend a few minutes focused on the work of that committee, because it's important for the country, important for Louisiana. Certainly a lot of key national issues, sort of headline issues to talk about, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. We can certainly go to those. The handout at your place mentions some of the key challenges dealing with out-of-control spending and debt. That's going to be a huge focus when we return to Congress in session in the fall. Energy policy, which is actually a bright spot, an opportunity if we take advantage of it for economic growth, and that certainly impacts my work on the Environment Committee that I'll mention, and Obamacare. I've been doing a lot of town hall meetings around the state, including Bossier City this morning, and that's the top fear, frustration, concern, call it what you will, that comes up over and over. So we'll have plenty of time to talk about that, but I did want to talk about my work on this Environment and Public Works Committee, because it's not sort of an obvious headline, but it is important. That committee, as its name suggests, Environment and Public Works, is fundamentally about 2 things, both of which are particularly important for us in Louisiana. Environment policy, anything EPA related, trying to oversee EPA. And the other side of the house, Public Works, is just that, infrastructure. Roadways, highway bill, water infrastructure, WRDA bill, Water Resources Development Act, core projects, Coast Guard, etc. And those are all important priorities for the state. As I said, as amazing as it may sound, I've built a really good working relationship with Barbara Boxer. Now, I got to admit, when I first signed up to run for the U.S. Senate, if somebody had told me as I drove to qualify for the race in Baton Rouge, oh, by the way, I have a little crystal ball, and one of your top work partners in the U.S. Senate is going to be Barbara Boxer of California, I think I would have turned the car around and gone right home. We are miles apart on all sorts of issues, including some key issues that come before the committee. But we've worked hard to bridge the partisan divide where we can, and that certainly starts on the infrastructure side of the house, which is also important for Louisiana. The first thing we did in this new Congress is meet, get together, work very hard, and compromise to produce a water resources bill, a so-called WRDA bill, Water Resources Development Act, that regulates our water resources, including all Corps of Engineers projects and all policy that impacts the Corps of Engineers. Because of that working relationship, because of my role as lead Republican on the committee, I was able to win a lot of reforms of Corps of Engineer processes that are long overdue. Any of y'all who have worked on projects like the Red River that deal with the Corps, any of y'all who have done developments, public or private, that deal with wetlands issues, know how frustrating that can be. So we won some hard-earned victories there, although we have a lot further to go. We advanced a lot of important Corps projects, maritime, like Red River issues, but also flood and hurricane protection, which certainly impact Louisiana. And we advanced some policies to get the dredging we need on our waterways nationwide and to fix the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, which is a trust fund sort of like the Social Security Trust Fund, meaning money that's supposed to be dedicated for certain purposes has been regularly stolen from there and used for completely unrelated programs. So we made some good progress there. We passed that bipartisan WRDA bill through the committee unanimously. Pretty tough for anything to pass unanimously in a deeply divided committee like ours, but we passed that unanimously through the committee and then passed it through the floor of the Senate. Now we're waiting and hoping for the House to act, which they're going to do. I've been in close contact with the chair of the House Committee, Bill Schuster of Pennsylvania, and they're going to act on their bill in September, and then we'll try to reconcile all of the differences and get this signed into law, which again will be important on a number of fronts: core reform, maritime projects, hurricane and flood protection. The next big challenge we have on the infrastructure side in terms of this committee work is equally or more important, probably significantly more difficult, and that's the next highway bill. We have been continuing the federal highway program, but only by fits and starts, only often a few months at a time. We need to get beyond that and put a reasonable, well-run highway program on a sure footing with a longer-term reauthorization. So that's the goal. Key to that are important reforms to the program to do high-priority work and to build public confidence. And then key to that is to stabilize the revenue base of the program, because fundamentally we've been having a declining source of revenue, the federal gas tax, which has been static, so its buying power declines over time. But federal highway needs, which continue or even increase over time, and we need to stabilize that. As a conservative, I want to do that while not increasing the overall tax burden for middle Americans. So I'd like to dedicate more revenue to that important program. That's a government function that I think the huge majority of Americans agree with, including conservatives, but overall not increase taxes, so have some compensation for middle-class families. So that's the next big challenge that we'll be tackling. On the other side of the House, in terms of committee work, is environmental, EPA-related issues. And there, quite frankly, Barbara Boxer and I go usually in different directions, and there's very intense and very sincere disagreement between virtually every Republican on the committee and every Democrat. I've been spending most of my leadership time on the committee on the conservative side pushing back against what I consider really rampant over-regulation by the EPA, and many actions where I think this EPA, this president, his EPA leadership go beyond their legitimate authority and go beyond their legitimate executive powers. So I'm constantly doing oversight, pushing back against actions that I think are ill-conceived and are really going to hurt job creation. On a number of fronts, because of EPA action, we're hitting real walls that are going to be a big impediment to economic development. A lot of these increased regulations are soon going to put Northwest Louisiana, most of Louisiana, a lot of the country in so-called non-compliance. And that is going to make it difficult to impossible to bring new industry and new jobs in. So we need to find a more workable solution. The one exception to this rule of more partisan disagreement on the environment side of the House that I was working on is on a chemical safety bill. Federal law about regulating chemicals is way, way outdated. Everybody, left, right, and center, agrees that it's way outdated and needs to be updated. Now, there's a lot of disagreement about how to do that, but everybody agrees it needs to be updated. My goal is to update it so we obviously have important health and safety protections, but at the same time, we encourage and don't stifle innovation so we can continue to be a leader in terms of innovation for industry and the chemical industry in particular. Again, we were at loggerheads in a partisan divide on this issue for a long time. I led Republican efforts, and Senator Frank Lautenberg, who was a very liberal member of the Senate from New Jersey, led the Democratic bill. I reached across the aisle, worked with Frank and others for literally years, and for a long time to no avail. We couldn't find full common ground. But a few months ago, we really scored a major breakthrough and came together on a Lautenberg-Vitter bill, a compromise bipartisan bill. It won widespread bipartisan support. Many original co-authors, Democrats and Republicans. And so that was a real breakthrough on that front. Sadly, Frank was in his 80s, very ill health. Sadly, Frank passed away just a few weeks after that breakthrough, less than a month. But his work and that compromise is certainly going to live on, and we're working very hard to pass that through the committee soon and then the Senate, and then get it into law. That'll be, as I said, the exception to the rule. Hopefully, it'll become a model how we can score breakthroughs even on the environmental side that are reasonable solutions for updating law and doing things in a sane way that have important health and safety protections, but also give assurances to industry that they can continue to innovate, be world leaders in that regard. So again, I just wanted to mention this. It's not in the headlines as much. And from a lot of the headlines, quite frankly, you would think that nobody on Capitol Hill ever works across the party divide. But that does happen, particularly on less high-profile, less ideological issues, like particularly the infrastructure issues I mentioned. And of course, again, the work on this committee, both the infrastructure side, obvious challenge here, finishing I-49, and the environment EPA side, regulating so much industry that's so important for Louisiana, means it has real direct impact on all of us. Well, as I said at the beginning, there's plenty else to talk about, including the three big challenges I mentioned on the handout. So with that, let me just throw open the floor. Please raise your hand, and I'd love to hear comments and suggestions and questions from the floor about anything I mentioned or anything else that we're facing as a nation and that we're trying to grapple with as a Congress. Please just raise your hand who wants to start us off. Yes, sir.
Senator Vitter, I'm a year short of 60, and I don't think we're leaving our country to do well for our children and grandchildren. I'm thinking of 2.4 trillion is what the government seems to be taking in. We're spending 3.6 trillion, and we're printing another trillion that we're not counting. And I'm wondering how the children are going to survive.
Yeah, well, the simple answer is that if we stay on anything like that path, they're not. And I'm not sure we're going to survive before they're even in charge, before it hits. And that's why I think it's the greatest economic challenge we face. Look, the next crisis is not going to be a banking crisis like we just got through. The next economic crisis, unless we do something about it, is going to be a crisis built on this unsustainable spending and debt. You know, our accumulated debt, almost $17 trillion, that's the size of our whole economy. So economists, probably the single biggest metric in this category that they look at is the so-called debt to GDP ratio. We're at 100%. That's a horrible place to be. Every economist, left, right, and center, will tell you that. They can't predict, like I can, with certainty, when that crisis will hit. But everybody will say, if we stay on this path, it will come. It will be a crisis. And it will have things like, eventually, sky-high interest rates. And the really scary thing is, we don't know when it hits. But once it hits, it's too late. Once it hits, it's like a snowball building, rolling downhill. And once interest rates start going up, it's virtually out of control. You know, every percentage point, single percentage point we put on the interest rate, that costs another even $1 trillion in terms of debt service for the federal debt. $1 trillion. It's like having an adjustable rate mortgage in the Jimmy Carter era. Anybody remember how fun that was? When interest rates went from single digits to 21%. Well, it's like the country has an adjustable rate mortgage. Only the numbers for the country are a little bigger than for your house or my house. And that's the challenge, and we need to fix it before it's too late. Hopefully, our debate and discussion this fall, which is going to be all about that spending and deficit and debt, is going to yield some plan. I'm not saying we can fix this overnight, we're going to get to a balanced budget next year, but at least we need a plan and be on a roadway to sustainability, because we have a budget picture right now where the budget never balances. Not in 5 years, not in 10 years, not in 50 years. It never balances. We need a plan to get on sounder footing. Yes, sir.
Senator, the president has repeatedly said he's not going to wait for Congress. He just keeps issuing executive orders that appear to me to be patently unconstitutional.
Yep.
What's the Congress going to do to rein in this president?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I agree with you. You know, every president has an inflated view of his powers. Every president butts heads on that with every Congress. But this time, it's on a different planet. And the number of executive orders and the overreach is quantitatively a whole different ballgame. So I completely agree with you. What is this Congress going to do about it? Absolutely nothing, because of where I work in the Harry Reid Senate. So every time we try to rein that in Congress, that's defeated on a party line vote in the Harry Reid Senate. So what's the Congress going to do about it? Absolutely nothing. What are we going to do about it? Otherwise, I work with a lot of folks outside Congress to challenge it and fight it in plenty of ways, including filing lawsuits, which we have on a number of instances, and we're winning some of those, like against President Obama's illegal so-called recess appointments. We don't recess appointments at all. We've won that in court. It's going to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the challenge is President Obama does this stuff with a stroke of a pen, and we have to try to undo it each time with a 2-year, $2 million lawsuit. So that's the challenge. Ultimately, what should we do about it more globally? Ultimately, we need to do something about it at the ballot box. That's the ultimate answer. We blew that, in my opinion, last year. But democracy is a work in progress, and we're going to have a chance to correct that to some extent next year with congressional elections and beyond. Yes, sir.
Is there any possibility that we will start using some of our natural resources like natural gas and the oil that we have instead of importing all of it?
Yeah. Well, we have to some extent, but we need to build on that success. I think the biggest economic game changer in at least 25 years, maybe my lifetime, I'm 52, is this discovery through fracking and horizontal drilling and new technology of enormous domestic energy resources. My dad was a petroleum engineer. He's been deceased for a while, but he worked almost his whole career at Chevron, was chief of production out of this region. And when he was alive, he would have never imagined that we have the resources we now know we have and that we can access with new technology. The good news is that the stuff on private land we're largely getting to, and that's mostly natural gas. And that's been a game changer economically. Just a few years ago, we were all counting the years until all of the chemical industry was overseas in India, China, until all of the paper and wood products industry was overseas. That's turned around 180 degrees, and it's for one reason and one reason only, and it isn't a program out of Washington. It's cheap, reliable American natural gas, which is possible because of the accident of history that it happens to be on private land, and the feds are largely not the one. Now contrast that with the oil side. On oil, we have the opposite accident of history or geology, which is it's mostly on public land, offshore and public land in the West. And there, it's a completely different story, which is the feds are in the way every step of the way, and we're not accessing them. So my goals on this front are pretty simple. Step one is let's not screw it up on private land. There are plenty of folks in Washington who want to overregulate that. And step two is let's open up access over time on public land and get to the resources we can offshore and on public land onshore. But we're certainly not doing that now. For instance, the president's 5-year plan, which is a plan yet any president has to put together under law for offshore drilling. It's half as much as the previous 5-year plan. So it's backing up, it's moving in the wrong direction, not expanding access.
Senator, do you have any comment to offer on the suit filed by the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority against the oil and gas?
Yeah, great question, and this is a big deal for the energy industry and for jobs in Louisiana. I've read the suit. I don't profess to have done all the legal research on it. My gut is, my first reaction is that I don't understand how an individual levy board can possibly have the role and the proper authority to file that wide ranging and impactful a suit that would impact all of energy and coastal policy for Louisiana. It seems to me that legitimate authority should only be at the state government level. Now again, I don't claim to have done all the legal research. I couldn't write you a legal brief to that effect, but that's my gut. This is a big deal one way or the other, and I think that decision has to be made statewide. I suspect, I don't have a crystal ball, but I suspect that's going to be borne out over time, and that no individual little levy board is going to be allowed to do something that has that far-reaching repercussions. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to ask about what conversations are going on in Washington about the fact that all we don't really make our manufacturing disappear in the country.
Yeah.
And what kind of conversations are going on to Washington that we can rectify the fact that everything's coming out of China or another country, India, Indonesia, and we're without jobs, and now Mexico, and it just seems like all our materials are coming from everywhere but the U.S.
Yeah. Well, there are plenty of conversations. One problem is they're often two sets of conversations that are very, very different among conservatives and liberals. To me, the single most important factor in this regard, or the single most important opportunity that we need to build on, is what I mentioned a minute ago, harnessing this opportunity of cheap, reliable American energy. that has been a game changer and has reversed the trend you're talking about in many instances. Now, I'm not saying it's wiped away the problem, but it's literally reversed the trend in the chemical industry. It's reversed the trend in the wood products industry. A lot of those opportunities are coming here for one reason and one reason only. It's not the regulatory environment, it's not the tax environment, it's cheap natural gas. So first we need to not screw that up, and we need to build on that success. Unfortunately, the crowd in charge in Washington, particularly in the administration, sees it a lot differently than I do in terms of the impacts of dramatically increased regulation, higher taxes, etc., and what that's doing to all sorts of jobs, including manufacturing jobs. I think that's a major factor running jobs away. I think that's the major factor preventing a more robust recovery.
Senator, do you see anything happening in the near future, next 2 or 3 years, as it relates to tax code reform?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of discussion about tax reform. And on the surface, there seems to be a lot of agreement. And the broad agreement, left and right, is we need a simpler, fair tax system. We need to get rid of a whole lot of loopholes and deductions and credits and special interest deals, and use that to lower rates and make our code simpler, fair, and more competitive for American business. Now that's the 40,000-foot level. The problem is once you try to come down and land, the devil's in the details, and there are major differences when you get into those details. The biggest difference that I think is going to prevent that sort of fundamental tax reform under President Obama is he wants to use a bunch of that revenue from getting rid of deductions and credits, not all of it, but a whole bunch of it for a big tax increase. And conservatives like me want to use it all to lower rates to make us more competitive, to grow the economy. And oh, by the way, when you have economic growth, you have increased revenues. But it's a big difference just passing a tax increase versus growing the economy and enjoying the increased revenues that way. So that's a big difference between someone like the president and somebody like me. I think that's going to prevent achieving that fundamental tax reform in the foreseeable future, but we'll see. Sir.
What about Egypt? Could you talk about that just a little bit? It seems like we may ignore it, but we should have been participating.
Yeah, it's certainly going from bad to worse, so there doesn't seem to be any reliable side we can safely ally with. To be fair to the president, I thought he was not being effective or helpful with many of his comments, but then I thought he was certainly outdone in that regard once my colleagues John McCain and Lindsey Graham went over there. So, I was actually supportive of the military's action a few months ago because I think the Muslim Brotherhood, although they were elected, they were quickly going in a fundamentally undemocratic direction that was going to be a threat to the Egyptian people and to us. Democracy isn't just about one election. Hitler believed in one election. That's not good enough. Democracy is about minority rights, constitutional rights, and full and free and fair elections ongoing. Muslim Brotherhood wasn't into that. And so I favored that change. Now, though, in the last 10 days, the military has made it awfully hard to stay with them. And so there's no side that doesn't have serious blood on their hands. I'm not sure at this point, like you say, maybe we could have made more of an impact if we started in a different way years ago, but I'm not sure at this point if we can have a major immediate impact from U.S. policy. Well, I can tell I'm getting the hook. Carol is a very polite diplomatic hook, but it's definitely the hook. So let me wrap up and thank you all for the invitation to be here. Thank you.